Welcome to Frightening Frauen. We have Tyler, Lee, and Kayla with us today. And we discovered Kayla on TikTok, and I thought that she would be perfect on here. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am 21 years old. I'm based in upstate New York. I have a beautiful 1-year-old daughter who I am a first-time mother to. And my TikTok is a content about borderline personality disorder.
Yes. And I love your take on it. I love how you were talking about it. And I think I discovered you through one of your videos that came up on my For You page. So,
Oh, that's awesome.
um, but what was I going to say? Something. Um, Lee, help me.
Sorry, I see my son outside, so I'm wondering if he's
Oh,
coming over here or not.
that's okay. No, so I love it. My mom has borderline personality disorder, and I think I was in your live and asked you some questions about that because I've had a lot of guilt myself with how to deal with having a parent that is not getting help for theirs and navigating
Yeah.
that and realizing that I can't control whether or not she gets help. So how
Yeah.
how did you discover that you were living with this?
Um, I've been in therapy since I was 8 years old. And at first it was just therapy for my ADHD. Um, and a couple of behavioral issues. And then as I got older, it started moving kind of into the more depression and anxiety, like teenage kind of stuff. Um, and then it started getting a lot worse. We went out 14 when I was in my first relationships. That was when my therapist was like, there might be something else going on here because I wasn't acting unquote normal in my relationships. I wasn't acting like a regular teenager would in relationships. Um, I was very, very scared of being abandoned by my partners, and I would do pretty much anything. I would threaten self harm. I would threaten to unalive myself. I would threaten all this stuff. I would never threaten to harm them,
Mm-hmm.
but I would threaten to do things to myself in order to get them to not leave me. And that wasn't very typical of a teenage girl, even though everyone kind of thinks that it is because of Hollywood and the stereotypical teenage girl like Twilight when Bella tries to do things to hurt herself. And I feel like we really have to kind of move away from that stereotype that that is normal, because that was a huge sign that I had BPD, was the fear of abandonment and the suicidality and the self-harm, the paranoia, because I would get so terrified that my friends were all out to get me. And it wasn't a schizophrenia type of terrified, it was a borderline type of terrified. Um, so then when I was 16, my therapist told me, she was like, hey, I think you have borderline personality disorder. I'm like 99.9% sure that this is what you have, but I can't put it on paper until you're 18 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So we will work on it starting right now. And then once you're 18, we'll put it on paper and we'll work on it even more. So that's how I ended up learning that I have BPD.
Wow, that's great that you were so honest with your therapist because I know that it's so hard to diagnose because people aren't seeing themselves accurately or they don't want to see it in themselves. And that goes for a lot of different conditions, but borderline is a huge one. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I think it's so important for all of us, no matter what, like no matter where you are on a spectrum of any sort of mental health, is seeing yourself through other people's eyes as well as your own and kind of figuring out where in the middle we realistically are at because it's so difficult to see because you can see all your justifications for what's going on in your own head, but realizing from the outside perspective what's going on and how we're interacting with the world is completely different.
Exactly. And I feel like people need to keep in mind that everyone will react to a diagnosis differently. Some people will not accept the diagnosis at all. And unfortunately, it's designed and hardwired into cluster B personality disorders to reject that disorder, to it's kind of hardwired into the cluster B disorders to not be self-aware, to not recognize that you're making those actions and that you're having those issues. People think that it's solely a narcissistic personality disorder thing to not recognize when you have those issues, but that's actually one of the things that all the cluster B disorders have in common, is that it can be very difficult for us to admit it. And to see it in ourselves, because the way these disorders work is they prevent us from seeing that in ourselves. And for me, I got very lucky. When I was diagnosed, I was she told me what it was and the symptoms, and I was like, oh snap. And everything just kind of clicked into place for me. I was like, this is what's been going on with me. Now I know this is what's been going on. It was similar to having, if I could relate it to something physical, I'd say it was very similar to having a bucket of cold ice dumped over my head, because at the same time as it was like, wow, I feel great, it was also very painful for me to learn to accept that I had a trauma-based disorder that other people caused for me.
I can relate to that with separate diagnoses, but I, it's kind of, for me, it was very bittersweet in getting diagnosed with both autism as well as CPTSD and attachment. I have, I forget what, gosh, because
Reactive attachment disorder?
it wasn't reactive attachment. It
Oh,
was a different one. I had disinhibited attachment disorder,
okay.
where it was kind of the opposite of reactive attachment, where I wasn't attaching to anybody, but everybody. So I wasn't attaching to anybody, but I also didn't want them to go away at the same time. I wanted them to be attached to me, but I didn't want to be attached to them. And
Okay, that makes sense.
my oldest, and it was a trauma response to the way I was raised and not feeling, not trusting anybody else. And so after realizing that and being like, okay, I do need these attachments. I do need to be able to like feel like I have somebody and not just that they have me. Um, was very eye-opening. And my oldest son also has disinhibited attachment disorder, and he has autism. So he has very similar diagnoses to me, but they're more extreme than mine. And so I understand him, but being on the other end of it, it's very hurtful at the same time. So it's I don't know, it's interesting, and I see how I treated others through how he treats me, and it's healing, but at the same time, it has a lot of guilt in it.
Yeah, I get kind of the same feeling being a self-aware borderline, because once you become aware of the things you've done, whether it's because you're seeing them through someone else's actions, or you've just looked back on your own actions and you're kind of like cringing at all the stuff you did, um, it's like, it's a weird kind of feeling, because all at once you're just like, at the same time as you're like, okay, so this is the problem and this is how I fix it, you're also consumed with this kind of guilt for how you made other people feel and the things you may or may not have done to the people you loved in your life. And it's very difficult, especially for people with these disorders, to kind of struggle with that, because a lot of times borderlines in particular will go into what we call shame spirals, which is where we feel absolutely worthless. We feel like we're not worth living. We feel like, the only way to possibly make up for what we've done to people is to take ourselves out of the equation.
I can totally see that in the people in my life who have it, that and they are not self-aware. um and they do have that same like shame in their life, and I, on the outside looking into it, it feels very manipulative, but at the same time, I feel like they really do believe that and feel that way. And so it's very,
Exactly.
yeah, it's very hard on the outside. So what can people, when you are in that mode and you are feeling that way, what can people around you that care about you do to help?
The best thing to remember, before I get into what would help, the best thing to keep in mind is that when we do go into these shame spirals, it may feel manipulative, but that's not our intention.
Mhm.
Our intention is simply to voice how we're genuinely, truly feeling, because um, a lot of the time we are compared to people with narcissistic personality disorder. Now, we do have some similarities with narcissistic personality disorder, like saying things like, oh my God, I feel so bad about what I did to you, I'm going to hurt myself. But within these disorders, there's kind of separate reasonings for saying that. Now, I can't speak for everyone with narcissistic personality disorder, and I certainly don't want to demonize anyone with narcissistic personality disorder. However, there are some people with that disorder that could potentially be using that as a manipulation tactic, and there are people with borderline that could be using that as a manipulation tactic. But the best thing to do is just to keep in mind that if someone is making threats like that, to take it seriously, because you never know if they're telling the truth or not. And when a borderline, especially a borderline, says something like that, or anyone with any disorder says something like that, you want to take it seriously, because you never know. And every time that I've said I've wanted to do something like that, most of the time I have ended up following through with those threats, because I just felt bottom of the barrel, like, oh my God, how could I have done this to the person I loved? Like, for example, there was one time it was due to my borderline, but I'm not blaming my borderline, because a lot of people feel like, um, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent
No, you're
here,
fine.
but
You're fine.
a lot of people feel like people with borderline personality disorder use it as an excuse for their behaviors. And it's not an excuse for our behaviors. However, our symptoms can explain certain behaviors that we carry out,
Mhm.
but it's never an excuse. For example, my symptoms of impulsivity and my tendency to drink and my tendency to crave affection from whoever's there in that moment, um, that all kind of mushed up and led me to cheating on my ex when I was with him. And it was my decision. It was 100% me. I did it regardless of the symptoms that sort of, I guess they helped. They kind of, the symptomology of BPD helped me to make that bad decision, but it was ultimately my decision. And I feel like a lot of people don't understand that when we say things like that, we are discussing how the disorder could have played into it, rather than saying, oh, well, it's not my fault because I have this disorder, so it's not my fault, because that's not what we're saying. It still is our fault, but we just have to put in the work to get better with it, and put in the work to recognize our symptoms before they lead us to making these decisions that we don't necessarily want to make.
Yeah.
Uh, I have a close friend with BPD that I've known her since before she got the diagnosis and started doing the work. And before the diagnosis, like if I was to like have a conversation with her, like a really honest conversation about something, because she had like these patterns of behavior of like getting connected to someone and then becoming volatile because she wasn't getting what she wanted, even though she never even told them what she wanted. It was so I would point out the patterns, and then she would, that criticism where I was trying to be helpful would cause her to do downward spiral into these like like literally was worried that she was going to hurt herself. It was like terrifying, where I started avoiding being honest with her because I was so afraid that she was going to hurt herself when I caused her to do anything that might trigger a moment of self-reflection, right?
Mhm.
And there was nothing I could be like, try to talk her through it and be like, I am literally not judging you. I'm trying to help. I think you deserve better. And it didn't matter, because at that point she just felt so awful in herself. And she did eventually get a diagnosis, which at first she was like, no, I don't have that, and fired that therapist. And then she eventually got the diagnosis from another therapist and has done like years of therapy. And now like um she can, she sees it. It's like this secondary process where she's looking at her behaviors, and instead of reacting right away, she takes time to really like think through it and not just react the way she would have always. And it's been like, I'm so proud of her, but I'm also just really happy for her because she's not being strangled by this like misery programming that she had in her in the same way. It still impacts her, but like she's just a happier person that's more connected with herself. And but I'm still dealing with, like, I'm still afraid sometimes to talk to her. Like I like basically had a trauma response to and I'm still learning to like trust that the work she's done has made her more stable and stuff.
Yeah, of course. That makes perfect sense, actually. With borderline personality disorder, a lot of us do struggle to accept. I was kind of a rare case in that I immediately accepted my diagnosis. Um, I didn't really second guess it or question it when I heard what it was. I was kind of like, yeah, that's exactly me. That is correct. Um, but there's this actual book about borderline personality disorder. I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. It's called Walking on Eggshells, because a lot of the times people with borderline personality disorder, one of our biggest issues is that we feel our emotions to the extreme all the time. If we're happy, we're ecstatic. If we're mad, we're raging. If we're if we're sad, we're almost to the point where we're suicidal. Um, and because of the intensity of our emotions, it can make people feel like they have to walk on eggshells to and tiptoe around us and our emotions in order to not set us off. And that's where the self-awareness comes in. That's where we have to really look at ourselves and look at our behaviors and our emotions and be like, okay, I'm feeling very out of proportion. What would be the proportional way to react to this situation? What would be the way to react if my feelings weren't as big as they are? Because we have to kind of frame it like, okay, I have to kind of pretend that my feelings aren't this big. And that doesn't mean ignore the fact that your feelings are this big, but it means how they are. And then internally, I will deal with them myself, or I will talk to my therapist or someone I trust about how big my feelings really are.
And is that the DBT that you were talking about in your life?
Yes, DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, and it is the #1 recommended therapy for people with borderline personality disorder. It was actually created by someone with borderline personality disorder herself, Dr. Marsha Linehan. She has equated borderline personality disorder to be the emotional equivalent of having third-degree burns over 90% of your body.
Gosh, that's one way to look at it. Because when you were talking before about knowing that you have it and knowing that it's a barrier, and then moving forward with that, knowing that it's going to be more challenging for you to do things, but you need tools in order to move forward and continue. And it's always going to be a challenge, but knowing that it's there and using the tools, it's kind of equivalent for people who have physical disabilities of my leg doesn't work. I could just choose to not do anything anymore, not do anything about it, or I can use aids and it's going to be harder for me to do certain things, or there will be certain things I can't do. But I know that if I use these aids, I can move forward and continue on with the things that I want to do. It'll just be a little more challenging. And I don't think I think it's hard for people who don't have any sort of mental or psychological disabilities or any conditions like that to understand that it is a barrier and it is something that you need tools for, you need therapy for, and it takes time to develop those things in order to move forward in life and do the day-to-day things that come easy to some people.
Exactly. And I feel like a lot of people need to realize that hidden disabilities are just as real as regular disabilities. Like, you wouldn't shame someone for using a wheelchair or having cancer and taking medication. So why do we shame people with mental health for taking medications? Or why do we say that people with mental health issues should just get over it and work past it when it's a lot harder than that. It's not as simple as that. Yes, we do have to work past it, but stop making it seem like it's the easiest thing in the world to do just because it's mental rather than physical.
Mm-hmm. And then also knowing our own limitations, setting boundaries with ourselves and others, and being okay with that. I know Lee and I both have to do that with our with our neuro spiciness of
Mm.
this isn't something I can do, and it's okay for me to say I can't do this, and it's okay for me to need to take a break and take time for myself, and having to realize that that is a form of self-care for us.
Yes, my
Yeah.
BPD actually prevents me from working in food service. My BPD and PTSD combined, they prevent me from working in the food service industry or the retail industry because I worked that once and it was terrible. I had a horrible experience. My manager didn't give a crap about mental health. I almost got fired because I was having too many PTSD episodes at work because unfortunately my coworkers would constantly yell at each other, throw things at each other, and it just wasn't a great environment for me to be in. And I would show up to work and give 100%, but then when I got triggered by my PTSD, I had to leave because I would be in an episode and I wouldn't be able to handle it. I'm a victim of domestic violence. I am a victim of sexual assault. I can't handle it when people are raising their voices around me, yelling at me, or even just around me, throwing things. I can't handle that. And that wasn't really respected. So I told myself that I would only, from now on, I would only look into getting into fields that I want to get into, like the human services field.
Mm-hmm. Which is great. I think we need more people like you that understand whether or not they have it or not, but like really dive into understanding the differences from people and not treating everyone like they're all the same. We need more people like you in those fields. It's
Thank you.
huge.
I appreciate that.
They should pay better.
Oh, absolutely. What I don't get is when people like enter a human services field for the money, because one, they don't pay shit. And two, if you're going into a job for the money, don't go into a job that's designed to help people. You
No,
should
Right.
be there because you want to help.
no, exactly. And because I got offered a position here as a domestic violence and sexual assault advocate, and they pay 15 an hour. And I was like, that you first of all, they needed a degree, which I have the degree, and I'm like, anyone with a degree, like they can't afford their student loans in $15 an hour. Like, I want to
Yeah,
do that, but it needs to be a livable wage. I mean, if I didn't need money and I won the lottery, I would do it. And I would just be like,
exactly.
donate my pay back into the services that help these people. But I need to be able to survive too. So it's really
Exactly.
difficult. Um, but yeah, so you did say that the um, the conditions, the cluster B conditions, are a trauma response. Do people already have tendencies and then trauma happens, or does the trauma cause it?
So, what typically happens is it's usually a combination of genetic predisposition and trauma.
Mhm.
Like your parent doesn't have to have it for you to have the genetic predisposition for it. Your parent could be bipolar, schizophrenic, or whatever, and you would have a genetic predisposition to develop something similar to that, like a personality disorder. Um, so what happened with me was I had a genetic predisposition for mental illness. And then I was traumatized at a young age. So that kind of kicked it into place. What happens when you do have the genetic predisposition factor is it kind of lies dormant and then until there's a trauma. And then once there's a trauma, that kind of starts to come out in adolescence and it kind of starts to be more and more obvious as you grow older. Um, as you're going longer and longer without treatment, that you have some type of personality disorder is how the cluster Bs usually work. For antisocial personality disorder, you can't be diagnosed with it unless you were diagnosed with conduct disorder by the age of 15, I believe. You have to have been diagnosed with conduct disorder in order to be considered having antisocial personality disorder. And that one they do not diagnose until you're 18 under any circumstances. Um, and the other personality disorders, narcissistic, borderline, and histrionic, they tend not to diagnose under the age of 18, but when it's very obvious, like it was in my case, they will. The difference is when you're an adult, you have to have a 6-month history of pervasive patterns of at least 5 of the 9 symptoms um, for 6 months, and they have to be disruptive in your life in order to meet the criteria for that diagnosis. But when you're a minor, when you're younger than 18, you have to have a pattern for at least a year.
Okay, that makes sense. My daughter, her father has antisocial personality disorder and has been diagnosed. Finally, is getting help for it. Was diagnosed at like in his early 20s, but didn't start getting help until his late 30s.
Yeah.
But she has he's not been in her life since she was a baby. He did a lot of really horrible things in and out of jail, addiction stuff. Um, but I still talk to him to get like history for things that are going on with her. And it's been really eye opening, the similarities. And she did have trauma from him at a young age.
Mhm.
And just the abandonment and loud and throwing things and abusing me in front of her. But um, she, so her therapist says she shows signs of borderline, but it can't obviously can't diagnose her yet, but is keeping an eye on it. And we're kind of giving her those tools now to deal with those things as she gets older, as she's going through puberty and everything. But early intervention is so huge for everyone, and it
It
helps.
really is.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I can't imagine where I would be today if I had gotten the help that I needed at a young age. Because I started therapy at 7, but it was all religious based. And it was through, they could talk to my mom. It was very, they were not, they didn't have any degree or anything like that. It was just people that you talk to at the church. And
Yeah.
they just taught me the opposite of what I needed for having autism. They taught me how to mask better is basically what they taught me. It,
So kind of like ABA.
yes. ABA. Oh my gosh, ABA, we're actually going to have another guest on to talk about that. They have psychop. Oh my gosh, I can never say the word. They're a psychopath. They were diagnosed. And they do a lot of the same work, like trying to educate people on what that really means and what getting help really means and the stigma behind it versus what they really go through.
Yeah.
And that's what's so huge. But yes, it was kind of like ABA where they were like teaching me how to basically mask better on everything, different aspects of my life. But I wasn't diagnosed until my late 20s with autism. I was misdiagnosed with ADHD until then. Um, but yeah, it was, gosh, I can't imagine if I had actual help and they actually like listened and
Yeah.
understood it growing up. And that's what I want for my kids and what I want for everybody.
Oh,
Just,
of course. I plan on putting my daughter in therapy when she's old enough because my family is very dysfunctional. And while I'm trying my best to not let it affect her, I know that it will.
mhm.
So for the time being, like, I'm going to put her into therapy because I know that it's going to be hard for her to have a mother with borderline personality disorder, even though I'm doing the work that I need to do on myself and I'm getting better for her. There's going to be times where I get overwhelmed and triggered. There's going to be times where, I may not respond appropriately. So I'm definitely going to get her into therapy early on, make sure that she's given the coping tools and skills that she needs. Make sure that I can explain to her in a child friendly way that mommy has kind of the way I plan on describing it to her is like, when you get a tummy ache, mommy gets those, but in her head.
Yeah, yeah.
Mommy gets sick in her head, and that can make mommy very angry sometimes. That can make mommy very sad sometimes, but it's never your fault. It's not on you to make mommy feel happy. I definitely want to raise her with the knowledge that, because I was raised with the fact that I felt like sort of my parents depended on me for my dad depended on me for emotional stability. I felt like he um kind of blamed me for his mood swings and things like that. And I just want my daughter to know that my mood swings are never her fault. They are because I have something going on in my brain that is not because of her.
Yeah, and there's certain things that happen in our emotions when they are big that we can't control, like our body language, our tone of voice. We can't always control that. Crying and different reactions that aren't necessarily lashing out towards somebody else, but they are still visible to that child and could be confusing. So that's huge. And having just another safe adult they can go to that isn't you is like there's so many things that our kids that could happen to our kids that rightfully so feel weird to go to your parent about. And so
Oh yeah.
I really feel like all kids should have another safe adult they can go to, whether it's therapy, a teacher, a family friend, somebody that's going to be able to know, be able to discern whether it's something that they need to report or not. But so that if something was happening in the home, that the child could go and talk about and get out. And it holds us accountable as well as parents to be able to know that we're not doing the wrong thing, like illegal things with our children. But um, there shouldn't be anything that they can't tell that person that's going on.
Yeah.
I tried to get my son into therapy when he was young, and he just like he would just sit there and refuse to talk, like he just wouldn't participate at all.
Mhm.
Um, and my ex, the other parent, is narcissistic personality disorder, and of course that was really hard for him growing up with that. And I did my best to like give him tools for navigating it and stuff, but it is something that was also negatively impacting me. But yeah, I just really wanted him to have the tools, and he's just like, so even now as an adult, like I'll be like, well, therapy could help you manage your stress better, and those tools would really help you, and you deserve the benefit of that. But he's not quite there. I don't it's like I don't know where that came from because he was so little and he was already so resistant to it. But um with the like big emotions and stuff, like on that I had a lot of emotional dysregulation when my son was smaller. Like I would get overstimulated and like he would be talking and then touch me and I'd be like, because it was too much. And I didn't know about like the autism or ADHD until the last like year or so, the last 2 years. And so once I learned about that and was able to look back at like the patterns of the behavior, and I wasn't like, I didn't behave like my parents did, who like screamed at me and called me names and hit me and did all that stuff. I just would be like, no, no, it's too much. Please stop. But sometimes I would do it with like a really strong intonation. And I don't know what's normal or okay in terms of like body language or intonation. So I tend to err on the like robotic side of things where I'm very non expressive of my feelings. So in those moments when I did express emotions, it felt like I was being abusive, because I couldn't, I didn't know the difference. And once I started learning about the emotional dysregulation, and I went back and had conversations with him and was like, these are things that I've been carrying guilt since you were little, because I feel like I was like hurting you. And now I understand what was happening in those moments. And we were able to talk about it. And he said that sometimes it did hurt his feelings when, because he would feel rejected because I would be like, go away, not right now, or whatever. And it's something that we were able to talk about. And I think it's cool that there's, with the younger generations who are now starting to have kids, that they have more tools on average to be able to have an awareness and to have those conversations a lot sooner, you know, so that their kids can grow up with that awareness.
And I think, like, coming off of what you just said with the tools, having social media and having the visibility, I feel like it's a double-headed sword though, because some people are seeing little aspects of things in themselves and then they're like, oh, I have that. Instead of being like, oh no, I have some tendencies that go along with that. It's not necessarily what it is. Um,
Yeah.
but then they also have the tools of, if they do have it, seeing that they're not alone and seeing that there is help and figuring out the resources and how to navigate the systems, because we didn't have that even 10 years ago. The ability to know, like, have a community that we could reach out to easily and get answers and figure out what are the next steps, where do I go, um, what resources are even there for me. And that's, I think the biggest thing that I've taken away from social media and the visibility is the answers are out there.
Yeah, that's why I try to make a lot of posts that are like, hey, ask me questions, like comment. And I don't usually get a lot of engagement on those posts, but I still post them because, like, hey, maybe people will share them with other people who might have questions. Um, because I feel like the biggest way to destigmatize is to educate. And we all have to do our parts to destigmatize the conversation around mental health. And I feel like some of the most stigmatized disorders are the personality disorders, the cluster B personality disorders, because they do come with toxic tendencies. They do come with, the tendencies to manipulate, the tendencies, whether it's intentional or not. They do come with things that are very undesirable behaviors. Um, it's not really the same thing as depression or anxiety, where everything is kind of just internalized. Like, people with cluster B disorders externalize their feelings unless they're like a quiet borderline or something. And people will take that the wrong way and be like, oh, you're mad at me, or oh, I did something. And it's like, no, you didn't do anything. Like, when a split is triggered within me, I used to just go nuts and be mad and yell and scream at whoever I was splitting on. And now I'll just calmly be like, now that I've done the work, I'll just calmly be like, hey, you triggered me. I'm splitting on you. So I need space from you so that I don't say or do anything I don't mean. Because when I'm splitting, my brain goes from I love you to I hate you in like 5 seconds flat. And I would never want to tell someone I love that I hate them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And can you explain a little bit about what splitting means for people that are listening?
So, splitting is a very common symptom of borderline personality disorder, where we kind of go into our black and white thinking, which is a staple of the disorder, all good or all bad. And someone, usually our favorite person, can trigger the split, but it's anyone can trigger it. It's when we have idealized someone, we love them, we care for them, we think very highly of them, and then when a split happens, something happens to trigger it, but it can be something that they aren't even aware that they did most of the time. Um, and when we split, we go from that, like that, all that love and admiration, to oh my God, I feel despised. Like, I despise you. I don't like you anymore. And this is just a feeling we get in our minds. It's not an accurate reflection of how we truly feel about the person when we're in that split. It's just kind of our brains make a switch, and we have to kind of ride it out and try not to act on it, do our best not to act on it, because we know that it will be over eventually. Even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment, we know that it will be over eventually, and we will go back to loving that person. It's just something that happens. We don't want it to happen. We don't try to make it happen. It's very similar to when um when someone with depression experiences suicidal thoughts. Like, they don't want those thoughts, they just kind of happen.
Yeah. and they want it to go away, and then they do things to try to make it go away that aren't necessarily healthy, and I deal with that.
Yeah.
um, so looking over my childhood with my mother, and probably the biggest time that I like while you're talking about that I can see, and it was really hard for me to see it from any other perspective than my own in the moment, and it
Of
coming
course, you were a
towards
child.
me. Um, but is the things that she would say that were so horrible and so, but, and it was almost like she never said it later. And she would go
Mm.
back to like ignoring that it ever happened. And that was just a thing that happened. And I don't really feel that way. So you don't need to think that I feel that way anymore. And I'm like, but I still feel that because it happened. Like when she told me she wished she aborted me, when she told me like that I was the cause of her divorce and all of this stuff. And then she would go back to acting normal, and to me it still hung on and clung to me, and it wasn't normal anymore, and I still felt like she felt that way about me. And also then trying to go through it in my head of like trying to figure out, well, is it true, did I cause that, is that my fault? And never really dealing with it later when she was out of that mindset. And because I was afraid that if I tried to deal with it with her, and I did a few times try to deal with it with her, and then it would blow up again and it would cause another split for her, for me to try to deal with it. And so it never got dealt with, and it's still to this day never has.
My dad has exhibited some splitting behavior, but he's never been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. He's just an alcoholic. And he gets mean when he's drunk. He's been getting a lot better over the years. He's actually in a program right now for his alcoholism. And I have had moments with my dad where my dad has admitted to intentionally triggering me, like pushing my buttons and triggering me so that he could see how far he could push me, sort of like an experiment. And that really stung because he has intentionally pushed me into episodes where I was suicidal, homicidal, because one symptom of BPD that a lot of people don't talk about, that I made a video on this that kind of blew up on Facebook, um, was that we get not only suicidal, but some of us get homicidal when we're triggered. It's not always just suicidal ideation. And I feel like a lot of people don't talk about it because they're ashamed of it, or because they're scared that other people will be scared of them. But it's a very real thing about mental health to be homicidal that we need to talk about and we need to discuss, because if people don't discuss it, they're never going to get help for it.
Yes, that is huge. And that's the other guest I was talking about that we haven't had on yet. That's a big thing that they talked about. They talk about on social media a lot is what they almost did, what they got caught before it happened, but what almost happened and how it got there, and what we need to do in society to not stigmatize it anymore so that it doesn't get there for as many people. And because if we're ashamed of things and don't talk about it, like postpartum depression, not talking
I
about
had
it,
that.
exactly, yeah, and a
Me
lot of
too.
people that have, and
I
I did
hit it.
too, and
I
I
hit
hit
it
it,
to the point
yeah,
where I had to go into the hospital because I didn't talk about it. And it got to the point where I was seriously thinking about hurting my daughter and I wasn't talking about it. So then there came a point where I was like, wow, I need to go to the hospital before I do something to hurt my daughter, because
yeah,
I didn't want to hurt her. And that was never something that I thought that I would actually do. And I never tried to, but I was having very serious thoughts about it, like images flashing across my mind of me doing various things to harm her. And it was scaring the crap out of me. And I feel like people don't realize that just because someone has a homicidal ideation, it doesn't mean that they necessarily want to hurt anybody. It's just an ideation. It is an intrusive thought. It is something that they don't necessarily want to do, but something that their brain is kind of just forcing them to think about. Like there was this one time my dad was intentionally triggering me by invalidating my trauma. He told me that the sexual assault that I'd been through was my fault, and that I just was intimate and regretted it, and that it wasn't really what it was, all that good stuff. So Um,
Been there.
I reacted. I had a rage episode, and it was the only time in my life that I have ever truly been homicidal to the point where I almost did something, because I actually was throwing DVDs at him. I was throwing books at him, screaming at him, trying to get him to stop. And then this was when I was 18. I ran out of the house because I felt like if I stayed in there one more minute, I was going to stab my father.
Yeah. And I think that's really common. So for people who have either a lot of different mental health illnesses, but things that make us feel really strong, for abusive people in our life to try to push you to that so that they feel justified. And then it causes the reactive abuse. And then they can focus on that instead of what they did. And
Exactly.
and it's very, very, very common. And those people are attracted to people that they can push to that point because it can make them feel justified in how they treated you beforehand because of how you reacted.
Absolutely.
It's
I used to
so
have a list of people that I was going to take care of, like of, when I
the
was a
purge
kid, that was
happened.
part of, yeah, that was part of how I dealt with like the feelings and the helplessness that I felt in being in such an abusive environment, was just having my revenge plotted out. I'd go to the library and read about, things that you could do to people to end their lives and stuff. And, I thankfully I outgrew it, but there was like a window of time there where I was just dark enough that, it could have gone another direction. And I had like so much like rage that I learned from my mom. And so when stuff made me mad, I would just like put my hand through a door or, throw stuff and stuff like that. It's something that I worked on a bit in my teens, but as soon as my son was born, I was like, I can't be like that anymore. And just started working on it like a lot, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And over the years, the rage part it's not, I no longer feel like I'm holding it in anymore. It's like I feel like it's finally turned into like different sets of emotions and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
With
was,
my,
oh, sorry.
you're good. With my daughter, she actually lives with my aunt right now, and I see her on weekends because while I have gotten immensely better with my mental health is not at a point yet where I thought it was good enough to take on, because if I thought that things would have turned out this way, I wouldn't have had my daughter. I just simply wouldn't have. Like if I thought that I would be at a point where I couldn't take care of her, I wouldn't have had her, because I'm very pro-choice, and
Mhm.
I would not want to bring a child into this world that I couldn't take care of. And I thought I could take care of her, and then I realized a bit too late that I couldn't. Um, it was around the time she was almost a year old. I asked my aunt for help, and I was like, listen, I am getting very overwhelmed taking care of her 24/7, day to day. I am very frustrated with it. My mental health is going down because I can't do the things I want to do. I can't see my friends. I can't talk to them. I can't do my TikTok like I usually do, which is something that really, really helps my mental health, is being able to do my TikTok. And it wasn't really that I wanted the freedom and just wanted to run wild and crazy again. It was just that not having that freedom was affecting my mental health.
And you didn't want it to
And
negatively affect your child.
Yeah.
exactly, I didn't want my daughter to sit there and struggle because I was struggling. So I
Hmm.
asked my aunt, I was like, hey, can you take her in for maybe a year or two while I get my shit together? And she
Yeah.
said, absolutely.
It takes a lot of strength to do that, to be able to like admit to yourself and then, to miss out on that time.
It's
Mad
yeah,
props.
Thank
it's
you.
I was thinking about that. I was listening to a podcast about postpartum, and how much people judge women for giving up partial or full custody of their child at when they realize that they can't care for them or something happens. But then they also
We
judge
can't
them
judge
when,
them because then that's just
yeah,
putting children into a bad situation. Like I knew that if I kept my daughter, I would not intentionally do anything to harm her, but I knew that mentally I wasn't going to be able to push myself past my things that I have, like my ADHD paralysis and
mm,
things like that. I knew that at this point in time, I wouldn't be able to get past those kinds of things in order to take care of her the way that she needed to be taken care of. And there would have been some unintentional neglect going on.
yeah,
So I chose to split custody with my aunt. So I get to see my daughter on weekends and it works out right
and
now.
yeah.
That's what's working for us.
Yeah.
In that podcast too, it had two different cases. One where they gave up the child, and it was very similar leading up to that point, and the other one that they harmed the child. And the comments from the one who gave up the child, because it ended up in the media and everything, people were like, how could you do that? And then the one who harmed the child, like, why couldn't they just give the child up? And it was like they cannot
You
stop
can never,
themselves.
There's no
yeah.
cognitive dissonance there.
No, no. And it's like she did the right thing. And I understand why the other person didn't, because of the judgment. That's why they didn't, because they had contemplated it. They had tried to, and then their family was like, no, you can't do that. That's you being a bad mom. And it's like, then they did something, going through postpartum. Luckily, the child survived and now is with family. But the comments, it's just like the complete lack of any sort of, gosh, it's just,
The peanut gallery needs to be quieter. Let's,
Yes,
yeah.
and we need to be louder so that people know that they're not alone.
absolutely. I actually this year I was invited to speak, do a presentation on BPD at the National Active Minds Innovation Conference for mental health. I couldn't go, unfortunately, due to a lack of funds because they don't fund your trip or anything. You have to kind of pay for it all yourself. But I am planning to go next year. I've actually asked my family if that could be my Christmas present, if they could just give me the funds to go. Um,
Oh, that'd be so awesome. That's, I'm glad they invited you. That's huge. And it shows that people are listening and people want to hear and need to hear what you have to say.
yes.
I'm definitely in the description for this going to put your TikTok, because people should join your lives and ask questions and interact and show that their support so that more people can get help and you get more visibility, because you have a lot of great things to say, and I'm sure you're always learning too, and want to see other people and how they do things and different things going on in the community. But I think it's huge, and your responses were so great. I mean, I know I was asking a lot of questions in there, but
Thank you. Oh, you're okay. I love it when people ask me questions.
I just have so many. And that's why I love that we've been having a lot of guests on here, because we get to learn about different people and how our different minds work, and different resources that are out there. So, what would your take home be? So, if you had someone in front of you who thought that they might have borderline or one of the other conditions that you talked about, what would their first steps be?
Your first steps would be to definitely find a therapist who specializes in personality disorders because there's so much stigma, even in the mental health community, even in the therapist community, about people with personality disorders. I got very lucky that I didn't, like, according to other people's experiences, I got very lucky that I had a therapist that off the bat was okay with personality disorders because a lot of people get therapists who will refuse to work with them because they have a cluster B personality disorder. They'll automatically deem them as untreatable, even though that's not true. I think the biggest take home that I would want someone to get from this is that you don't have to be ashamed of your symptoms so long as you are willing to grow and learn from them.
Yes, that's huge. It's and use the tools that you have available to you. That's a big thing for me. Um,
Absolutely.
always be getting new tools and learning about yourself and others and be able to not, I mean, there's always going to be some guilt and shame because of society and how we were raised and grew up, but learning that there are others out there and find a community of people that love you and you can talk to and be completely honest with and aren't going to judge you for that.
Yes. I'm actually a part of a Discord community called Cluster Blossoms, and it's basically everyone that's in there has some form of cluster B disorder.
Mhm.
And we're all just packed into this space. We've got a bunch of different channels. We even have an unmasking channel where we basically can go in there and just write out how we're feeling, no mask, nothing. Antisocials can talk about their tendencies, narcissists can talk about theirs, borderlines can talk about theirs, and histrionics can talk about theirs, and there's no judgment. You
I
know, no matter
love
how bad
that.
the thoughts are, there's no judgment because they're getting it out in a healthy way rather than acting on those thoughts.
With people who get it and understand, and then someone else might read that and be like, I felt that way before too, and not feel
Exactly.
alone. That's great. And because I think people, there's just so much stigma in the media and it's so dramatized of what it looks
Yes.
like. And we see the most severe negative outcomes, and that's what we spotlight instead of all the individual people that do have these conditions and are living lives but have challenges. And instead we just are like, oh, well, that serial killer had that, instead of being
Yeah. I
like
do
there's
believe that
lots.
the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend actually does a very good job of depicting an accurate description of untreated borderline personality disorder, keyword untreated,
Yes, yes.
unmanaged. It does a very good job of depicting it without making it go all fatal attraction. I'm going to murder someone because they love someone else type
Yes.
things.
I love that. I actually was going to ask you about that show earlier. I love that show and I love the actress, I forget her name, but
Mhm.
she really, really wanted to have a really good balance between comedy and education in the show
Mhm.
and show people that it doesn't have to all be scary and that these things do happen. We can laugh at ourselves later for some of them and realize how ridiculous we were.
Oh
And
yeah, I do that all the time.
yes, and I can sing songs about how I'm feeling and how this is in my head and make it come out into the world and reality. And so you can see what goes on in my head outside. And they did
Yeah.
a great job on that show. Have you seen that show, Lee?
Mm-mm.
It you might like it because the lies that are in it, Lee does not like lying in shows. The lies that are in it have a purpose and they come out, and the honest truth does come out, and they deal with it.
Mm.
So,
What I really liked was in the first episode how she was kind of denying her reasons for moving. Like, because that's true. A lot of borderlines will deny the reason they're actually doing something in favor of the way they actually wanted it to be working out. Like, I told myself that I, um, let me think of an example. I told myself when I left my current boyfriend, because I also have bipolar disorder. I left him during a manic episode. I told him that I was leaving because I told myself and him that I was leaving because he was abusive. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. Um, I convinced myself that some of the things he did that were unpleasant were abusive. And I convinced myself that that was why I was leaving him. The real reason why I left him was to go sleep with my other ex.
mhm.
And that was during a manic episode, but we have worked it out and we're working on our relationship right now. So hopefully things will get better soon. They have been going in the direction of getting better. I feel terrible that I was so manic that I did something like that. Because not only did I tell him that that was the reason I left him, I also told multiple friends of ours. And then when I came out of it, I was like, wait a minute, he is not like this.
And then you had to go back to those people and
Yeah, I had to go back to those people and be like, hey, so about
yeah,
that.
I mean, that's huge of you to do that. Because there's a lot of people who would just double down and be like, nope, that's the way it was, and
Yeah.
just continue on because you don't want to look bad. But coming out and saying that you made a mistake, admitting to it, and admitting to why as well, it is valid. Um, but that it shouldn't have happened and correcting it is, it's huge. And more people should do that because we all make
Thank you.
mistakes.
Yeah. It's important for it's healing for the person that is impacted by it as well, because they get the acknowledgement that they deserve. And I think like acknowledgement is not it's not as acknowledged as it should be. You know, it's very, very powerful and just helps a lot when things go wrong or when we hurt people and stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's great. Are there any plugs that you want to do of where they can find you? I will put them in the description, but not everyone reads that.
Um,
So
I have my TikTok handle is Life of a Borderline. My Facebook is also Life of a Borderline, and my Instagram is Life of a Borderline BB, which is BBY, because Life of a Borderline was already taken. And then my YouTube channel is Life of a Borderline as well.
awesome. Oh, I didn't know you had a YouTube channel. I'll have to check that out too.
I do.
Definitely, like I said, join her lives, ask questions, learn. Even if you don't have any of these disorders, there's people in your life that do, and it is huge when you start to learn about people that are around you, and it might make you see them differently if it's someone you work with that you don't get along with and you don't realize that you're just not clicking because you don't understand each other. Just learning about other people is huge, and we should never stop growing and learning because we don't know everything. So um this is where I'm super awkward at signing off. So
It's okay. Me too. I never know how to end things.
it's funny in my podcast groups, they're like they've like watched them my like starts and endings. They're like, honestly, it works for you though, so just keep being awkward.
Yeah.
But yes,
Yeah.
definitely follow Kayla here and learn and grow. And we appreciate all of you joining in and listening. This will be on audio and video. If you're on audio and going to go over to the video, Lee and I are in costumes, so don't be alarmed.
Yeah, I do want to say that like I look like I'm sneering and it's literally just the way I did the mouth on my makeup. I'm not sitting here sneering. Like
You don't look like you're staring to me,
I
but
do. I like every time I looked at my thing, I'm like, God, I look really like unpleasant.
I didn't think so. I kept looking at the color of is it like a color changing, or
No,
is it
I
just
think it's
blue?
just the lighting here
Okay.
kind of changed. It's green.
Uh,
Shiny.
but yeah, so thank you everybody. And we will see you next
Thank
week.
you for having me.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you. And then
Bye, everyone.
bye.